So we all know that flu epidemics are caused by viruses, but bacteria also offer opportunities to study the evolution of populations. So the antibiotics in this bottle have the potential to kill most of the bacteria in my body, although some of those bacterial cells may have slight differences that give them resistance to the drug. These antibiotic-resistant bacteria are the cells that will multiply and carry on their genes for resistance. Over time, almost all the bacteria in the population will be resistant to the antibiotic. This is an example of selective pressure, the antibiotic, affecting the evolution of a population, the bacteria. These virus and bacteria examples are ways of studying the evolution of populations using microscopic organisms. But there are also many ways to study the basic biology concepts with larger animals.
Here, the last of the ice has cleared from the trees. Herds of elk graze the once barren lands, and forests stir with the promise of summer's bounty. And in the forest lurks danger. A pack of wolves has picked up their scent. A few days later, the pack found an old elk and secured a kill. In nature, it is survival of the fittest. The wolves prey upon the weakest of the elk and leave the strong to survive.
Wolves impose selective pressure on the elk. What that means is that the wolves prey on certain individuals, like the young or the sick, eliminating them from the elk population. But if the elk that escape predation have beneficial traits like they can run faster or hear better, then those traits will be passed on to their offspring. This will increase the frequency of those traits in the elk population over time. That's evolution through natural selection. But predators aren't the only selective pressures that drive the evolution of populations.
That's right. Here in Hawaii we can see a few very distinct types of evolution. But first, we need you to understand how populations evolve over time. To do that, we're here to look for one very unique little organism. Let's go.
We're looking for one of the great examples of evolution with biologist Megan Parker. It's a small group of snails in the genus Acatinella.
First, let's give you some background so that you can imagine the different factors that led to the evolution of these snails.
See these mountains we're on? They're really jagged with valleys in between. Each one of them has a cool, moist climate on the top with a different unique population of snails. But it wasn't always like that.
When the islands first formed, they were rounded. A single species of Acatinella tree snail likely lived there. Over time, erosion by wind and water created deep valleys. The valleys separated the once continuous population of snails into several smaller populations. Slowly, each population began to differentiate. Eventually, they were so different that they could no longer interbreed. Each population had evolved to become a new species. This is called speciation. When speciation occurs through geographic separation of populations, it's known as allopatric speciation.
It's easy to see how that might have occurred here, especially when we know that these snails can live their whole lives on a single tree. It's likely that small mutations, in combination with random changes in gene frequencies in the population, or genetic drift, caused the population of snails to differentiate enough to result in speciation.
So you can see how the topography of these mountains led to the isolation of the snail populations, resulting in speciation. And since we're having a hard time finding the snails in the field, let's head to a rearing facility to observe these species of snails.
We're at the University of Hawaii at Manoa Endangered Snail Breeding Lab. So we're a captive rearing facility. We're kind of an emergency room for the remaining species of snails in the islands of Oahu. These are our environmental chambers. We have 5 of them, and inside of these chambers we try to replicate the conditions of the remaining habitat where the snails live in the mountains. We have this PVC framework with a drain tray. your basic garden sprinkler that we use to replicate rainfall. 3 times a day for 1 minute, it will rain on the snails, sort of what happens in the mountaintops, if you're familiar with our orographic rainfall here on Oahu. What we have here, this is what we call our fungus incubator, and this is where we grow the food that we feed to the snails, that we supplement their diet with, because they're grazing the leaves that we put in the containers with them, but just in case, we like to give them a little something extra. We isolated this fungus off the leaf of a native tree many years ago, and so we've just continued to grow it for them. And look, here we have some snails feeding. We work with 14 different species of Achatonella and Parcellina snails. The special thing about the snails is that they have achieved some amazingly dynamic speciation of coloring and morphology.
Jen tells us, though, that this diversity is at risk because of introduced species and habitat loss. But the guy who knows it best is the lead on this project, Dr. Michael Hadfield.
Then along comes the 1950s, and Hawaii was overrun by then with the African snail. And so there was pressure put on the Territorial Department of Agriculture, and without much thought to what they might want to preserve that was here, they began introducing predators. So the giant African snail was the target. So people went looking for things that ate snails. And the worst is this thing called the rosy wolf snail. They released it down low where there were African snails, and within a few years they were up in the mountains eating the native snails.
Because the snails evolved without any predators, they didn't evolve any physical or chemical defenses for predators that would evolve later.
As far as regenerating their population, it takes a long time. They're not like other snails that lay eggs. They give birth to one snail at a time, and it's a very slow process. They must be at least 4 to 6 years old before they can have any babies.
So we're going to go look for the predator of the Hawaiian tree snail, the introduced rosy wolf snail, right down here. Ooh.
So remember, island environments influence evolution in amazing ways. We've talked about how animals like the Oahu tree snails might have evolved as the creation of valleys formed distinct populations. Over time, these populations became distinct species. We've also touched on the fact that populations have unique characteristics that's likely due to a lack of predation pressure. Can you think of any other animals that lived on the islands that evolved unique characteristics in the absence of predators? Here's a few hints. Remember, never stop exploring your world.
Here's my flip-flops.